it only takes a few examples of depictions of criminal aspects in spiritual groups to convince people that all spiritual groups are criminal or are going to be dangerous. So anything that looks even vaguely similar to those groups, so maybe they have an organization or they have a particular religious viewpoint, automatically there's that association which starts to be built in the subconscious that, oh, this is a group to be feared, and that there might be some sort of criminal thing going on, or you just shouldn't go near there.
Joining me today on the show is David. He's an investigative journalist for the Contras Reporter. I'm really happy to have him on today to learn more about this topic. David, welcome back to Total View.
Thanks very much, Jenny.
It's good to have you back. Okay, I feel like this is a really important topic that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's a subject that isn't even on the radar for a lot of people. To get us started, how about you give some examples of fear against spirituality, specifically alternative spirituality in society?
Well, I think that it's not on people's radars because it's been happening for so long. So if you look back at the media over the last, say, 30, 40 years, so back from around 1975 or so, there's literally hundreds of thousands of articles where new religious movements or small spiritual groups are talked about using the word cult, which has a very negative connotation, so people just automatically associate it with brainwashing, which has been debunked in law courts with physical abuse and financial abuse and that sort of stuff. So I think the media is probably the biggest example of fear being propagated towards small spiritual groups and alternative spirituality. And the outcomes of that can be pretty shocking. So you've got, say for instance, the Waco massacre or tragedy in 1993, and 81 people lost their lives in that. And a lot of religious scholars think that it was the involvement of the media and the anti-cult movement creating this fear of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, which led to the action that the ATF and the FBI took.
Right, yeah, and that's just really sad and really wrong. How about next you talk about the research that you did and what you learned about fear and how people have used it to manipulate people?
I started researching because I really wanted to learn how people were manipulated to make certain decisions or to have certain opinions towards things, particularly about spirituality. What I found was really quite shocking and quite surprising. It seems around the 1920s, 1930s, there was a concentration of quite prominent figures in society who were studying the human psyche, particularly in relation to fear and how people could be controlled or manipulated using their subconscious desires or subconscious emotions. There's three which really stand out, particularly in regards to fear of spirituality, because the research and the studies they were doing and the approach they were taking seems to still be applied to spirituality today. Those were John B. Watson, B.F. Skinner, and also Edward Bernays, who's the father of propaganda and public relations. John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner were both looking at conditioning, what's called behaviorism. For B.F. Skinner, it was radical behaviorism, and they were looking in experiments about how fear can be conditioned in people, which is kind of appalling in some ways because of the effects that could possibly have, particularly for John B. Watson's experiments, which were done on children. I think he famously said, "Give me a baby and I can make any kind of man." So John B. Watson conducted an experiment that he called the Little Albert experiment. So he took a stable baby and he showed him a number of stimuli which Albert just reacted to normally without fear, with curiosity actually. And one of the stimuli was a rat, which was his favorite. And then every time he started reaching out to touch the rat, John B. Watson would make a really loud noise behind him to scare him. And he found that every time Albert reached for the rat and he made this scary noise, over a short period of time, Albert started to develop fear towards the rat whenever it came near. And the interesting thing about that experiment was that once the rat was taken away, anything that resembled the rat also created that fear response. So things like a fur coat and even a Santa Claus mask with the same kind of white hair as the rat. From that, John Watson reached the conclusion that fear can be conditioned in people.
Crazy, crazy stuff. When I was reading that, I was just shocked, like the work of those three men. How are these tactics being applied to create a fear of spirituality?
So essentially, we as a humanity have been conditioned very similar to the experiments by John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner to be afraid of spirituality. When a really small number of dangerous or criminal groups are used to portray all spiritual groups, then we can see what was happening in the experiment with John B. Watson, where little Albert was initially made to be afraid of a rat, and then he was afraid of anything that looked like a rat. So by highlighting in the media that really small proportion of dangerous groups, it only takes a few examples of depictions of criminal aspects in spiritual groups to convince people that all spiritual groups are criminal or are going to be dangerous. So anything that looks even vaguely similar to those groups, so maybe they have an organization or they have a particular religious viewpoint, automatically there's that association which starts to be built in the subconscious that, oh, this is a group to be feared, and that there might be some sort of criminal thing going on, or you just shouldn't go near there. So that's probably the escape learning. In this situation, the people are just escaping from a perceived threat rather than a physical threat to themselves. But the avoidance learning then kicks in where, as I was saying, people kind of censor their own spiritual yearnings because they feel that to go into a small spiritual group means to be putting themselves in physical harm, and we're hardwired not to do that. Self-preservation is probably one of the strongest instincts that we have. So by creating this fear around small spiritual groups, people are essentially being shut off from the possibility of experiencing them. And that's really sad because the vast majority, like 99% of spiritual groups aren't harmful and don't have criminal aspects. And it's not just themselves that people would be fearing for, it's also their friends, their loved ones, their family. And that's what's called altruistic fear. So there was a crime survey in Britain in 1982 that showed that only 35% of people who responded were afraid of crime happening to themselves. They were actually afraid of crime happening to other people. So this is where altruistic fear comes in. It's a fear of not something happening to ourselves, but happening to our loved ones, to our family, to our friends. And a lot of religious scholars feel that this is a big driving force in the anti-cult movement. Back in the 1970s, when the media started becoming really negative towards alternative spiritualities, parents who had previously been happy with their children's involvement in alternative spiritual groups started to view them with suspicion, as if there would be some danger in them going along. And that's been a really big driving force in the anti-cult movement, is families who don't understand what their children are doing. Maybe it goes against the idea of a big house and a fancy car and a high-flying job and that sort of stuff. Maybe it's different from the choices that they'd make. They get afraid, and through that fear they try and pull their children out of the groups, or they get people within the anti-cult movement, they talk to the media and create this fear of these groups. I think that happens because alternative spiritualities are such an unknown. Most people, the majority of people, have never had experience with new religious movements. They're used to religion, which is kind of fits into a few boxes and it's fairly straightforward to understand for people. They're used to consumption and a commercial life, but seeing things which might challenge those beliefs can be quite scary. And it's very easy when you make someone afraid of something to then justify taking their freedoms away, and they'll actually thank you for it. They'll think that they're being done a favor, justifying violence against small spiritual groups, justifying what we see in the media in terms of the oppression. If it was any other group, if the media treated, say, racial minorities in the same way they treated spiritual minorities, there'd be an uproar. But it just doesn't happen because kind of the moral gatekeepers in the media just let that slip under the carpet because it's such an ingrained thing to be afraid of spirituality.
Well, that's why we're here, to let people know about that this is happening, because it's just not talked about, and it's major discrimination. This all sounds pretty horrible, pretty awful. Is there anything that we can do to change this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can do to change it, and the more people become informed about what's happening, the less effect that it can possibly have. So I'd say find out as much as you can about the different ways that people are manipulated in order to fear alternative spirituality, and never ever use the word cult to describe any spiritual group because it just perpetuates that cycle. If you know people who have this perspective towards alternative spirituality, obviously without forcing your views on them or anything like that, you feel comfortable to talk about the things that you've learned. So talk about the way that small spiritual groups are represented in society. Then we just help to kind of inform more people and educate more people. And I think that that's the best way that you can stop being affected by these negative representations is to learn and understand how they work and what the agenda might be towards spiritual groups. It's also important to understand that propaganda works on an emotional level, not a mental level. So propaganda is aimed at invoking really strong, basic instinctual desires, so the desire for protection, for safety and things like that. And so we need to understand the way that fear is used to influence our emotions so that they influence our thoughts and our actions. And if we can understand the way fear is used against us, then we can start to break its hold on us. And it means that we can pursue our spiritual yearnings without censoring ourselves, without self-governing our spiritual beliefs or our spiritual yearnings. And we're able to approach spirituality with an open mind rather than without bias. Of course, you need to use your common sense, but you need to approach it from a clear point of view rather than just approaching it from fear. Because if you approach things from a point of view of fear, then you're just going to see whatever you're afraid of.
Right on. Well said. Thanks for that. Well, that's all the time that we have for today, but thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it and all the work that you've done into this issue, because it's really important that it gets known. I know that we're going to have you back on Total View because you are doing more work into this topic with researching and writing about it. So yeah, we'll have you on in future episodes to dig into it more.
I look forward to it.
Yeah.